Hi everyone! If you're new here, like I am, my name is Silvia and I've just recently opened a YouTube channel where I make sewing tutorial videos. If you like sewing like I do, please have a watch at my previous videos. And if you like the content, hit the subscribe button. I would really appreciate that. For today's tutorial, I am going to show you how to make this cute dress. For this project, I've used Tencel twill fabric from Merchant & Mills. They are a British company and they make a beautiful range of fabric, all made in UK. I really like this Tencel twill fabric, and it's also more environmentally friendly than just normal plain cotton or linen. It's also very soft. For this dress, I used the Geranium Dress pattern Made by Rae. It's a very famous pattern in the sewing community, and it gives you the option of different necklines, sleeves, skirts, and you can also make a top out of it. For today's tutorial, I took it a step further and used the expansion pack as well, and I went for the gather sleeves and the collar option. Let's get sewing! For this variation of the dress, we will need the following pattern pieces. One pair of interfacing for the collar, so 2 pieces in total, and 2 pairs of collars, so 4 pieces in total. 2 back bodices from the main fabric, and 2 strips of interfacing 1.5 inch wide and as long as the bodice, and 2 back bodices from the lining, but here I'm using the same main fabric as the lining. 2 gathered sleeves, 1 front bodice that I have embroidered with some sashiko stitching, and 1 front bodice from the lining, 2 back skirt panels, and 1 front skirt. Let's get started. I'm going to start applying the fusible interfacing, starting with the back bodices. And I center the strips over the button markings and fuse them onto the wrong side of the pattern pieces. I usually press and hold for around 10 seconds. And I'm going to do the same for the 2 collar pieces. Now I'm going to pin the shoulders of the front bodice to the back bodice, right sides together, and sew them together with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. At this stage, we don't have to worry about finishing the seams, as the bodice will be fully lined. I'm then going to do exactly the same for the lining and then press the seams open. So let's now start working on the collar. I'm going to pin each interface collar piece with its corresponding under collar, right side together, and sew together around the outside curved edge and back edge with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm doing this leaving the inside curved edge unsewn. The collar needs some grading, so to do that I'm going to carefully trim the under collar seam allowance to just over 1/8 of an inch and the collar seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. This is going to help reducing the bulk on the seam allowance. Now it's time to turn the 2 pieces inside out, and I make sure I make the corners nice and neat with a point turner. I then press them flat with the iron. Move on to pasting the collar to the bodice neckline, pinning the pieces with the under collar facing down, and being careful that the edges of the collar meet at the center front. checking that everything is symmetrical and that the back edges of the collar will be about 1.25 inches away from the center back edges of each bodice. I'll baste it in place with the 1/8 inch seam allowance. It's now time to work on the sleeves. I have already finished the top edge of the sleeves with my overlocker, and I would recommend finishing the side seams as well at this stage, even though I haven't done it here. I have completely forgotten about it and I had to do it later on. I have also already sewn the gathering stitches. To do that, I set up my machine to the longest stitch length and the tension to the highest one, and sewn 2 rows of stitches between the notches, 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch away from the edge, and left long tails of threads either sides. I'm now going to pin the sleeves, matching the center to the shoulder seam first, then pinning the corners of the sleeve with the bodice edges. I'll keep pinning starting from the corners and moving towards the center, stopping when I reach the notches. To create the gathering effect, I pull the threads until the top of the sleeve is matching the length of the armhole that is still unpinned. I also take my time to distribute the gathers as evenly as possible between notches. I sew the sleeves to the armhole with a 3/8 inch seam allowance off camera. Well, actually, I did record it and then find out we ran out of space. Okay, so anyway, let's move on to the lining. On the wrong side of the bodice, I mark the armholes 3/4 inch away from each side. These marks are going to tell me where I have to start sewing in the next step. Next, I take the bodice and I lay it flat with the right side facing myself, and I roll quite tightly the sleeves towards the collar. I then place the bodice lining on top of the bodice, right side together, and I carefully pin it starting from the edges so I secure it in place. I also put a pair of pins where I have previously marked the lining, so they will remind me to stop sewing when I get close to them. I then move on to the neckline, matching the center of the lining to the center of the bodice, and then matching the shoulder seams. For the armholes, I just take the time to make sure I don't pin the sleeves, pushing them at the back little by little. So this is definitely going to be the fiddliest part of the whole process, so arm yourself with a nice cup of tea and a lot of patience, because it's going to take quite a long time. Also, to be fair, now it looks more like a hedgehog than a cute little dress for a girl, but I promise it's going to be so worth it in the end, so just trust me. So cool, I made it! Lastly, I will mark 1/2 inch from the edge of the back bodice pieces too, with the intention of leaving that space unsewn. I will now sew it along the back and the neckline, and then along the armholes, making sure I start and stop sewing between the marks. This is the trickiest part of the whole dress construction, so take your time and keep checking that you are not catching the sleeves in the inside. So now that it's all sewn up together, it's time to trim the seam allowance and clip all along the neckline. And then it's finally the time to turn it inside out, little by little. This is the most exciting part of the whole project, the one that I've been waiting for since I've started tracing the pattern. It really is exciting. I've been looking forward to this moment for a long time. It's basically like when you wait for Christmas morning to come, like when you are a child, and finally Christmas morning is there and you get in your living room and it's full of presents. So that's the excitement that I get when I can turn the bodice inside out. So hopefully, let's keep our fingers crossed that everything has worked fine. So let's wait and see. So here it is. I'm really pleased with the results. It looks nice and neat, and I managed not to catch the sleeves, so that's a great success. So now basically I'm just pressing it with the iron, and then we can move to the next step. Next, I'm going to pin the sleeves along the sides and pinning front and back bodices together, paying attention to folding the lining away. I sew them with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And this is definitely the most crucial step for today's tutorial, which is cuddling Flocky. He's very cute and fluffy, and he's my sewing assistant. He's very critical of my work, always there supervising. So let me know if you also have a sewing assistant. I would love to know their names. Now just pinned and sewn the front and back lining together with right sides facing. This is going to leave a small gap between the garment and the lining at the armpit area, so I'm going to close it now, stitching it close by hand. Let's move on to the hem sleeves. Here I'm folding and pressing a 1/4 of an inch toward the wrong side, around the bottom edge of the sleeve. I'm then going to press another 1/2 an inch and then add stitching all the way around to form a casing, making sure I leave a gap of around an inch to be able to add the elastic later on. Cutting 2 pieces of elastic 5 inches long. And with the help of a safety pin, I'm inserting it inside the casing at the bottom of the sleeve. Fiddly, but what I'm trying to do here is to stitch together the edges of the elastic, And basically I go back and forth with zigzag stitches a few times to make sure that it's nice and secure. Once the elastic is sewn together, I will just pull it inside of the sleeve. And I will then close the gap of the case with a few stitches. I also wanted to say thank you to everyone who has voted on my Instagram story. I was really debating whether to do the collar or not, so I just put a poll on Instagram and a lot of you helped me. Up next is the skirt. I'm going to pin the two back skirt panels to the front panel right sides together and sew them with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just note that the seam allowance here is larger than the rest of the dress. I'm then going to pin the back skirt panels and sew them together from the bottom up to the notch, back stitching a few times to reinforce the area. I now press the side seams open, and for the back seam, I fold the edges to the inside twice. Once over the overlocker stitches and over again one more time so the stitches of the overlocker are hidden inside. So this is a close-up of how it looks like before sewing it together. I think it's a very clever way of finishing the seam. It's very elegant. So now I'm going to stitch it all the way down. To sew this bit, I'm not really following any seam allowance. I'm basically eyeballing it and placing the needle right at the very edge of the fold and sewing it along up to the top. So we are almost at the end, so please bear with me. We are now moving on to the gathering of the skirt, and as we've done with the sleeves, we are going to set up the machine with the highest tension and with the longest stitch possible. I then sew 2 lines of stitches at 3/8 of an inch and 5/8 of an inch from the edge. So at this stage, I would recommend pinning the center of the front skirt, because it will come handy once I'll have to match the skirts to the bodice later on. I'm going to start pulling the threads until the width of the skirt is the same as the bottom of the bodice. This takes a little bit of patience, but it's also quite fun. Probably it's just me, and probably it's because I'm tired. But I find this very amusing and entertaining. Once it's finally the right width, I start pinning the bodice to the skirt, right sides together. And I do that matching the side seams and the center front and adjusting the gathers so it fits perfectly. I also make sure that I keep the lining away. I sew it together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. And again, this is a larger seam allowance than the rest of the dress. Arm yourself with patience because this is quite a long process and you have to really make sure that you keep checking that the fabric underneath is nice and flat. You can also make sure that the gathers are evenly distributed as you go along. And this is the exact moment when I started working out that something wasn't quite right. Until I found out that I ran out of thread in the bobbin halfway through, so I had to start all over again. We can now move on to finishing the lining. The pattern instructions give you two options. You can either stitch in the ditch from the outside of the dress, and you have to try to catch the lining in the inside. The other option would be to finish the lining by hand. I opted for the second one just because I really wanted to take it slow and enjoy my time drinking tea and watching videos on YouTube. I also think that the finishing looks better that way. So just showing you the finished look, and to be honest, I think it was really worth it. I'm now moving on to sewing the buttonholes. It looks like I'm going straight onto the dress, but in reality I have done many attempts before on scrap fabrics. And I would highly recommend you doing the same. You never know how the new fabric is going to react to buttonholes. This is really one of the latest steps, so we're almost there. And here is where I'm marking the button positions, moving on to then sewing them by hand. So we made it, can you believe it? This is officially the final step. So for the hem, I folded the edge of the skirt once of 1/4 of an inch and pressed toward the wrong side. Then I folded over again 1 inch so that the raw edge is now hidden. I'm now just sewing it in place. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. Thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao!